Welcome to part 2 of my video about New York and the East Coast hip-hop resurgence of the mid-90s. This is a legendary period in hip-hop history that I like to refer to as its East Coast Renaissance. I'm having a ton of fun with this project and I'm grateful for everybody who checked out part 1, left their thoughts and comments. This is undisputedly my favorite era in hip-hop, and here in part 2 I'm going to focus in particular on the year 1995, which was a fantastic year for hip-hop in general and perhaps the center point of the Renaissance. There are many different albums and artists that made it historic, so let's jump right into it. Let's get it. As a recap, the years 1993 and 1994 were just massive years for East Coast and New York hip-hop. Hip-hop exploded on a national stage in the late 80s with hip-hop's golden age, most of which was centered in New York. But then the West Coast took a little bit of New York's thunder away in the early 90s, making it the first time that hip-hop had been centered outside of its birthplace. But beginning in the year 1992, rappers from New York started to carve out this new aggressive sound with relentless, stark, realistic subject matter. By 93 and 94, artists like Black Moon, Wu-Tang Clan, Notorious B.I.G., Nas, and many others were releasing music with hard, aggressive beats, advanced sampling, and hardcore lyrics which told a tale of just how grisly life could be on the streets. And this emerged kind of as a shocking form of street journalism. I covered all of this in my part 1 video, and I encourage you to go check it out if you haven't already. So as the second half of the 90s dawned, as 1994 rolled over into 1995, we were truly in a second hip-hop golden age of sorts. The cultural impacts of Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers, Illmatic, Ready to Die, and other albums from 93 and 94 helped define this new era, and by 1995 rappers were getting even more aggressive and kind of doubling down on this new style. In the first 2 weeks of 1995, Brooklyn duo Smif-n-Wessun released their debut album, The Shinin'. Smif-n-Wessun were part of the Boot Camp Clique, which was the same collective that brought us Black Moon and their debut Enter the Stage in 1993. The Shinin' had next to no commercial appeal, and one thing about these hardcore Renaissance albums is most of them had some accessible tracks. But with regard to The Shinin', this was not the case, as this is one of the most hardcore and gritty albums of New York's Renaissance. The same production team that gave Enter the Stage its unmistakable sound, the Beatminers, were responsible for all of the beats on The Shinin'. The Beatminers doubled down on what they did on Enter the Stage and just gave us booming, gritty, guttural, trunk-rattling beats, with rappers Tech and Steel weaving together stories of the street in an aggressive but also laid-back manner. This smooth aggression was perfected pretty much right out of the gate, and Tech and Steel definitely had a unique style, as they pay tribute to the Caribbean heritage with some Jamaican patois in their rhymes. And to match these inflections from Tech and Steel, the Beatminers gave us more of kind of a raga influence on this album, which is very interesting with the gritty beats. And like I said, this is a very aggressive album, but when Tech and Steel weren't talking about stomping out their enemies, the overall aura of the music takes more of an introspective stoner vibe. The Shinin' gets a shout out here early in the video just because it was chronologically the first important album of 1995, but there were a lot of bigger releases to come. In fact, 2 of them came out on the same day, March 28th, 1995. These 2 albums were Big L's Lifestyles of the Poor and Dangerous and Old Dirty Bastards Return to the 36 Chambers, the dirty version. So as we know, Wu-Tang was just a huge part of why the Renaissance began and took off in 1993. And following their debut, de facto leader RZA had a plan to have his solo artists kind of release their own albums along the way. The first of this initial wave of solo albums was Method Man's Tikal, released in 1994. As Method Man was one of the more, I guess, commercial-friendly members of Wu-Tang, so RZA rolled out Method Man's solo album first, but another very marketable, unique voice was Old Dirty Bastard, so he was next up. ODB had been recording this album since before Wu-Tang's debut was even released, as he signed a deal with Elektra Records in early 1993, making him the first Wu-Tang solo artist to sign a deal. With RZA's direction in future years, this same thing would happen to most solo members of the group as well. ODB was known for his antics on the mic and would soon become known for his personal life and drug problems, and it's on Return to the 36 Chambers, the dirty version, that the world really got to know just how crazy and unhinged ODB actually was. This wild demeanor was not really indicative of the Renaissance stylistically per se, but the fact that he was single-handedly pushing boundaries was a testament to the Renaissance's evolution. And the Renaissance essentially gave these artists a new platform for them to just be themselves, whether that meant spitting harrowing street tales or just having this crazy, rugged persona on the mic the way ODB did. Dirty's unstable persona was very entertaining, and he made it clear that there was no father to his style. The Renaissance did feature the increased emergence of unique personalities on the mic, and this was actually way more prominent than in the Golden Age, where a lot of the MCs, they just kind of sounded the same. That's not to say that KRS-One and Rakim were clones of each other. There are some very unique voices from that era, but if you look at the majority of rappers from the late 80s and early 90s as a whole, there's a ton of monotony. ODB is a perfect example of this distinctiveness, and he solidified Wu-Tang's unscripted, unfiltered identity. Sonically, this album is about as Renaissance as you can get, courtesy of RZA, who doubled down on his dirty, dusty, quirky production style, with just a myriad of strange and unorthodox samples, which would go on to really characterize RZA's work. The hauntingly happy piano loop on Shimmy Shimmy Ya over guttural drums and just a devastating bass line really set the stage for ODB to be himself. The menacing and ominous Rawhide features one of the darkest beats on the album. That instrumental is just truly nefarious. And it's on Rawhide that ODB spits some of his best, craziest, most unhinged bars on the album, alongside great guest appearances from Raekwon and Method Man. The RZA's beats throughout the rest of the album fit ODB's style perfectly, and it seemed as if the two worked together to tailor the musical mood to ODB's maniacal musings on late album cuts such as Snakes, Protect Your Neck 2, and the somewhat lighthearted closer, Cuttin' Heads. ODB was the beneficiary of some of the RZA's darkest and strangest beats, frankly, and the way that the RZA really continued to push sonic boundaries on ODB's debut really helped the evolution of the Renaissance. And it's arguable that RZA was the most influential figure in developing the Renaissance sound. We're going to cover other Wu-Tang projects from 1995 in this video, as 95 was probably the best year in their existence. Overall, it just seemed like things were getting darker and darker from an East Coast hip-hop standpoint as 1995 went on, and this is further personified on the debut of Harlem rapper Big L, Lifestyles of the Poor and Dangerous. Big L was part of the DITC, or Diggin' in the Crates crew, which was mostly based out of the Bronx, and consisted of rappers and producers such as Diamond D, Lord Finesse, Showbiz and AG, Fat Joe, and Brooklyn's OC. Big L had also been part of the looser Children of the Corn collective around the same time, which interestingly enough featured a young Mace, Cameron, and Herb McGruff. After making some guest appearances on DITC records in the first half of the 90s, Big L was finally ready to put out his debut in early 1995. Today, Big L is celebrated as one of the best and most clever punchline rappers of all time. Overall, he's one of the most clever lyricists to ever touch a microphone, and his lyrical prowess is on full display on his debut album. Like many of these Renaissance albums, Lifestyles of the Poor and Dangerous features some dark, disturbing beats, but it actually kicks off with two more accessible cuts, Put It On and MVP. Both of these tracks actually had some modest radio success in late 1994 into 1995. But after these two cuts, which are honestly classics and some of the best mainstream-facing Renaissance hip-hop there is, the album just gets darker and darker as it goes on. 8 Is Enough is a menacing posse cut, which features the aforementioned Herb McGruff and Cameron, then known as Killa Cam. All Black features one of the most haunting beats on the album, courtesy of in-house producer Lord Finesse, who also contributes production for MVP, Street Struck, the title track, and Fed Up with the Bullshit. Street Struck shows Big L taking his exceptional lyrical skills in a conscious direction, and while overall the street-level journalism isn't quite as prominent on Big L's debut album, Street Struck is actually one of the best examples of the street-level journalism of the entire Renaissance. Buck Wild contributes production on Put It On, 8 Is Enough, and The Graveyard, which actually features an appearance from a young Jay-Z. Rapper-producer Showbiz from the duo Showbiz and AG also contributes 2 production credits, and really overall the production roster is well represented by in-house DITC artists who knew the exact vibe that Big L was going for, and they made it happen. I'll be straight with you, lyrically I think this is the most impressive album of the entire Renaissance. Big L was a once-in-a-lifetime talent who showed a relentless hunger, alongside a slapstick sense of humor with just some ridiculous bars. No matter how serious or joking the subject matter, the writing and execution style from Big L is among the best that the Renaissance had to offer. The beats from Lord Finesse, Buck Wild, Showbiz, and others are jazzy, dark, and booming, and Lifestyles of the Poor and Dangerous is one of the most quintessential examples of the Renaissance's sound. And while this album did really lay the foundation for Big L's legacy, this was one that wasn't huge in his lifetime. Unfortunately, about 4 years after this was recorded, he was shot and killed in early 1999. So the album has gained a ton of posthumous appeal. I really wish that that appeal would have been around when Big L was still with us, as the album didn't really do too well and Big L's professional career was in limbo until the late 90s. But Lifestyles of the Poor and Dangerous really did help set the standard for the second half of the East Coast Renaissance, even though most of it was made in 1994, and even though it does sound kind of like a first half Renaissance album, I don't say that as a bad thing. If you're enjoying this video, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, as new subscribers really help me grow as a smaller creator. Also, leave a comment below. What do you think of 1995's impact on East Coast hip-hop? I'm always down to discuss. So there's another very, very important album that came out about a month after Big L's debut. There are some soundscapes off of this album that I think are among the best of all time from any era in hip-hop ever. These beats were courtesy of a then up-and-coming teenage producer who had some key mentoring help from a massive name that broke out during the golden age. That teenage producer went by the name of Havoc, and alongside his partner Prodigy, they formed the duo Mobb Deep. Emerging out of the Queensbridge projects at the beginning of the decade as Poetical Prophets before changing their name in about 1991, they released their debut album Juvenile Hell in 1993 before re-emerging on April 25th, 1995 with The Infamous. Now, I think The Infamous is not only one of the biggest landmark records of the Renaissance, but one of the most important hip-hop albums of all time. And their success on The Infamous was a little bit unlikely, as their debut Juvenile Hell flopped. It did not do well, and Prodigy and Havoc thought about calling it a career after being dropped from the record label. They decided to give it one more go before folding, and man, I'm glad they did, because I don't think hip-hop would have evolved the way it did without The Infamous. So again, Havoc and also Prodigy were just 19 years old when this album was recorded in 1994, and this album just doesn't sound like it was produced by a 19-year-old kid. That aforementioned mentor who did help with producing, recording, and mixing was Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest, who did contribute production to 3 songs on the album, with Havoc doing the rest. It's this juxtaposition between sort of the bright, upbeat production of Q-Tip and Havoc's downbeat noir rap that really makes The Infamous very interesting. And yes, Havoc's production turned out to be especially dark. While, let's say, the beat miners were a lot more guttural and dark in their own way, Havoc made their beats kind of sound pedestrian, dare I say. And that's with all due respect to the beat miners. They are a wonderful production team. 30 years later, some of the beats off of The Infamous remain the most morose hip-hop beats I've ever heard, again, from any era. But Q-Tip brought that upbeat sense that he brought to A Tribe Called Quest, and the juxtaposition, the duality of these sounds is just mind-bogglingly fascinating. More on the beats in a second. Havoc grew up in the notorious Queensbridge projects, which gave his music a cold, dark edge. I can't see where else he would have gotten it. Prodigy was not from Queensbridge. He did not grow up there, but he did spend a lot of time in the neighborhood when he was younger. And he also grew up on the edge of poverty, moving around the New York area, and also suffered from a disease, sickle cell anemia. So both MCs were coming from a place where they were really suffering in one way or another. Mix this with the fact that they emerged during New York's Renaissance, and also at this tender young age, they actually had more music experience than most artists that were coming out during this time, with of course The Infamous being their sophomore record. Everybody else's albums that I've talked about to this point have been debut records. You put all these things together and just all the elements were there for a true bona fide classic. So I talk about the concept of street journalism and how important that is in the Renaissance, and lyrically this is the best front-to-back example in album format of this street journalism. It sounds like Havoc and Prodigy wrote down exactly what they were thinking. They did not truncate it, they did not censor it, there were no edits, there was no conformity, there was just raw, uncensored reality. And other Renaissance albums sound like this too, but The Infamous takes it to a whole new level. Take one of the lead singles, Survival of the Fittest. It's just a perfect encapsulation of these thoughts and ideas, of the mindset they were living in, having to scratch and claw their way through life and literally survive. And this is something that probably not a lot of people in this world can relate to. So while this music was made for those who were suffering alongside Havoc and Prodigy, to hear about these things as an outsider is just really cinematic. It caught my ear from the start, and it makes you sympathize with these guys. There's actually a strong emotional component to The Infamous, which is sort of masked in anger, but there's an underlying sadness about this album that just, it really hits me every time. The song Temperatures Rising is basically a heartfelt letter written to Havoc's brother, who was on the run from the law at the time. You have songs like Up North Trip, which chronicles a ride on a prison bus upstate and the associated sentiments. Trife Life is a story that involves romance that turns dangerous due to gang rivalries. And Cradle to the Grave, man, that is a wild, grisly track that just sounds all too real, as Havoc and Prodigy deal with a snitch in their inner circle and figure out what they're going to do with this person. Party Over wraps the album in appropriate fashion, not taking things too seriously, and these kind of laid-back sentiments also set the stage on the album's opener, The Start of Your Ending, 41st Side. I want to quickly give some focus on the album's fourth track, Eye for a Eye, Your Beef is Mine's. It's a bona fide street classic that features Nas and Raekwon, and while the beat is as dark and menacing as they come, it was on this song that an important new lyrical style emerged. The four MCs began talking over this very serious beat about the spoils of street life and hitting it rich through crime or extortion or whatever they were participating in. They talk about soft leather and luxury car seats and mink coats for the girlfriends, and this was a stark lyrical change from the previous track Survival of the Fittest. But more importantly, this marked kind of a new direction of where things were going lyrically in New York City's hip-hop renaissance. All of a sudden, there was this mafioso lyrical theme that emerged on Eye for a Eye that just celebrated the spoils of being successful in crime. So when it comes to Renaissance records, this lyrical theme first appeared on Eye for a Eye, though this mafioso gangster film lyrical style dates back to the early 90s and Kool G Rap, in particular his work with DJ Polo. It wasn't Mobb Deep, Nas, or Raekwon Raekwon, who were originators of this style. It was kind of Kool G Rap, but for Renaissance purposes, it first emerges here in early 1995 on the infamous. Havoc, Prodigy, Nas, Raekwon brought these seldomly used lyrical themes to the table and started mixing it with street journalism, and for better or for worse, this trend would really catch on for the rest of 1995 and into 1996. The album's centerpiece, which is actually its second to last track, but its most important cut, is Shook One's Part 2, which is a song that I'll come out and say is my favorite song of all time, hip-hop or otherwise. Prodigy and Havoc dropped these long, legendary verses that are as much of a first-hand testament to life on the streets as you will probably ever hear. And while the lyrics are legendary on this thing, it's Havoc's beat that really throws this song into outer space. It was actually recently named the best beat of all time by the hip-hop outlet Rock the Bells, so I'm certainly not alone in realizing just how special that instrumental to Shook One's Part 2 really is. The slowed down piano loop, the ominous horn sample, the drums and the snare, which was apparently sampled from the noise of a gas stove clicking. Everything here is just perfect, and dare I say, this is Renaissance hip-hop at its peak. This song is absolutely timeless, and when it's given a best beat of all time accolade some 3 decades later, you know there's something special going on. Havoc's production throughout the rest of the album is nothing short of astounding. Havoc uses this same slowed down and chopped piano loop that he uses on Shook One's on the song Survival of the Fittest. Again, one of the Renaissance's best beats. The beat on Eye for Eye seems to take its time, sort of plotting against the listener, while Nas, Raekwon, Havoc, and Prodigy hit us with just these relentless bars. Q-Tip took to the boards for Give Up the Goods, Just Step, and Temperatures Rising. These are a couple of the brighter beats on the album despite the continued gritty subject material. Q-Tip's snare samples on these beats are just as crisp as they come. They're just mwah. I think QU Hectic is probably the most underrated song on the entire album, using this weird swirling bass or keyboard loop over swift drums as Prodigy and Havoc essentially pen a love letter to Queensbridge and New York City. On the 11th track, Raekwon shows up again, this time with Ghostface Killah, the song Right Back At You, where the 4 MCs just continue to spit dart after dart over a beat with ear-shattering snare and head-bobbing bass. Drink Away the Pain is another Q-Tip beat, so things brighten up on track 14 after Cradle to the Grave, which is honestly terrifying. As on Drink Away the Pain, Prodigy and Havoc talk about alcohol, comparing it to a woman, while Q-Tip comes in and addresses materialism, setting up a strange verse about clothes and fashion and comparing them to a heist. It's actually pretty cool. Alright, enough about the infamous. I've already spent too much time on it, but the same way that Shook One's is my favorite song of all time, regardless of genre, the infamous is the most important album to me, any album ever released, and you know I love all kinds of different music. I just can't help talking about it in such length. I could have gone on for another hour, honestly. But since we all have lives, I'm going to keep it moving and talk about 2 more marquee albums that came out at the end of 1995. My plan is to do a long-form retrospective for the infamous coming in April as we celebrate its 30th anniversary. Up next from the Wu-Tang camp for solo albums were Raekwon and GZA. Both released albums in the second half of 1995 which sounded drastically different, which was an excellent testament to RZA's versatility as a producer. Raekwon was up first, and on August 1st, 1995, his debut album Only Built for Cuban Links was released. Let's go back to Eye for Eye off the infamous for just a second. It was on this track that the Renaissance version of the mafioso style emerged, and of course Raekwon was on that track. On his solo album, he takes these ideas and runs with them, as on Cuban Links we hear a constant mafioso theme pretty much from front to back on this record, and it does mix in with a lot of abstract lyrics from Raekwon and also Ghostface, who played a really solid sidekick role on this record. Ghostface appears on almost every track, and the two kind of come as a package deal even though it was Raekwon's album. And this album wouldn't be the only time in the Renaissance that we see this tag team action between the two. The album kicks off right away with songs like Knuckleheads and Knowledge God, and we see this lyrical mafioso theme right from the start. Raekwon spins these slang Latin mafioso street tales that really do take a few listens to truly understand. This theme is present throughout what turns to be a long, upbeat, cinematic record that commands the listener's attention through these dramatic, often string-based samples from the RZA. Guest spots are frequent, as pretty much every member from Wu-Tang Clan makes an appearance except for Old Dirty Bastard, but it is Ghostface that's most prominent throughout. There is one extremely high-profile outsider guest appearance on Verbal Intercourse, and that is from Nas, who was fresh off of his work on Illmatic, and he comes in on this Wu-Tang album as an outsider and basically out-raps anybody else on the album and drops one of the most legendary guest spots of all time. Now, during these years, it was well known that Wu-Tang did not work with a lot of outsiders. They mostly kept it in the family, so to have Nas on a Wu-Tang album was a pretty big vote of confidence that Nas was one of the most influential names of the time, but we already know that. Some of the other standouts include Ice Cream, which is a legendary Wu-Tang cut, as well as the tense and energetic 1-2 punch of Ice Water and Glaciers of Ice, the maniacal Wu Gambinos, the introspective Rainy Days, and the legendary Criminology, where Raekwon and Ghost trade battle raps over one of the RZA's most legendary beats of his entire career. The mafioso approach was the main lyrical theme for Only Built for Cuban Links, and it was the first album to exhibit this style from front to back. While it sounds like a movie and it's one of the most jaw-dropping things I've ever heard, all these spoils and celebrations that come from being a successful criminal who made a lot of money would lead to a sense of materialism within East Coast hip-hop, which became more of a theme as the 90s progressed. Rappers really did start to focus on riches and luxury, and eventually this made it more seamless for hip-hop to become a business. So while these fantasies on the mic may or may not have been reality, the desire to get paid was something that was becoming more and more prominent in the mid-90s, which would eventually lead to the end of the Renaissance and lead to a faction within East Coast hip-hop between mainstream and underground. While Cuban Links was an early example of this and kind of where the mafioso lyrical theme got its legs, RZA, Ghostface, and Raekwon, they were just making albums, man. They didn't plan for this whole thing to happen. I'll explore the mafioso theme and how that led to the Renaissance's demise in the next installment of this video series. However, by no means was this new mafioso style the standard. Many hip-hop albums were still coming out at the end of 1995 that still dealt with grisly street life. Onyx's excellent second record, All We Got Is Us, gets rid of any tongue-in-cheek fun that existed on their debut record. Honestly, this album is one of the darkest of the entire Renaissance, right alongside the infamous. Group Home's Livin' Proof was the next project for DJ Premier after finishing work with Jeru the Damager on The Sunrises in the East. Lil Dap and Malachi the Nutcracker were two younger MCs that were part of the Gangstar Foundation, and Premier took the two under his wing, gave them some legendary beats, and let them spit their game, which consisted mostly of street-level tales and bragging and boasting. Admittedly, neither Malachi or Lil Dap are very good rappers. They're actually some of the weaker MCs that Premier or Gangstar ever worked with. But this album is more well known for showcasing some of Premier's best work and really encapsulating the Renaissance's sound at its finest. By the end of 1995, there were a couple more important albums that really did focus on the mafioso style. Brooklyn's AZ made his debut on Nas's Illmatic as a guest rapper on the song Life's a Bitch. He spent most of his debut album Dough or Die talking about this mixture of street tales and these spoils obtained by crime life, and really did employ that mafioso theme. Dough or Die does have some incredible moments, but it did really help perpetuate the mafioso style, as did the debut solo album from the aforementioned Kool G Rap, 456. Essentially the godfather, pun intended, of this style doubles down on what he did with DJ Polo in the early 90s, but does it from a much darker, more violent perspective, as G-Rap spins up a furious lyrical hurricane over some excellent beats. In my book, I think 456 deserves to be one of these marquee albums from 1995, but it just doesn't get the love and respect it deserves. So yeah, while the mafioso style was becoming more and more prominent as 1995 went on, a lot of those core lyrical values that helped define the Renaissance at its beginning were still thriving. This was also the case within the Wu-Tang camp, as RZA turned around just 3 months after releasing Only Built for Cuban Links with Raekwon, and helped drop an album full of gritty nihilism on GZA's debut, Liquid Swords. Lyrically, this was way more advanced than pretty much anything coming out at that time, as GZA used extremely vivid wordplay to wind his way through 12 tracks of the most satisfying Wu-Tang solo stuff to ever see the light of day. GZA was definitely more introspective and was the strongest writer in the entire collective, using intricate literary tactics to spin up street tales, which were interspersed with many metaphors and themes, notably chess, which he and RZA are apparently very good at. On the song Labels, he weaves the name of many major record labels at the time into a track ripe with double entendres. On Living in the World Today, he gives us an introspective look into life on the streets in his native Brooklyn, without getting too vulgar and over the top the way that maybe Black Moon or Mobb Deep might. Cold World brings Inspector Deck into the fold, who nearly outraps GZA with a verse that is, in my eyes, as depressing and realistic of a street news report that you will ever hear from this era. Shadowboxing is more of a lighthearted moment that brings Method Man to the table, while Fourth Chamber is an energetic cut with a whimsical sampling job by the RZA, who brings in Ghostface and Killah Priest, who spit darts alongside RZA and GZA. And finally, the frigid, dystopian closer, I Got Your Back, serves as a reflection of GZA's life as a whole, and issues a stark warning to keep your head on a swivel if you're gonna try and survive on the streets of Brooklyn. Overall, Liquid Swords, it's basically the antithesis of Only Built for Cuban Links. While Wu-Tang was incredibly important in 1995, and as I said, that year was the best for the collective as a whole, RZA did really hit two ends of the spectrum in just a matter of months. Liquid Swords is cold, introspective, and probably requires a little bit more patience than Only Built for Cuban Links, and it does kind of take a while to unpack. There's really not much accessible about Liquid Swords as even the lead singles are either hard as nails or incredibly introspective. It's actually reasonable to speculate that RZA was the reason why hip-hop was kind of starting to move in two directions at the end of 1995. Of course, he didn't do this on purpose. This is just how things evolved. With Cuban Links, he gave us this upbeat, cinematic, flashy, almost accessible record that showed a healthy love of money and materialistic goods over slang-laden storytelling. With Liquid Swords, he gave us these cold, quirky beats that sort of laid the foundation for a new alternative sound to flourish. This is all taking place while GZA weaves together an introspective lyrical classic, an intellectual exercise that would serve as a preview of where hip-hop's underground may be going. This is all speculation, and it's just something I've thought about independently after years and years of loving both of these records. Let me know what you think in the comments about this. Am I onto something? Am I crazy? Do you agree? Do you disagree? 1995 was an incredibly active year for East Coast hip-hop, for New York City hip-hop, and looking back, it's one of the most critically acclaimed years in hip-hop history. From the punchline-driven street tales of Big L to the unhinged grittiness of ODB, to the noir rap that Mobb Deep rolled out on The Infamous, to an unforgettable 1-2 punch of competing auras on both Raekwon and GZA's debuts, it was a year to remember. It was a year that the mafioso trend first emerged, which would lead New York hip-hop unknowingly at the time into sort of unethical territory as the 90s ran their course. It was the year of spitters, dark beats, booming bass lines, and cinematic production which pushed envelopes like never before. It was the chronological center of New York City's hip-hop renaissance, doubling down on what classics in 93 and 94 had achieved and pushing boundaries even further. In my third installment of this video series, we'll explore how all of these trends continued to evolve in 1996, and the eventual fork in the road that appeared within East Coast hip-hop by 1997. We'll talk about the expansion of geographical scenes on the East Coast, as well as getting into some late Renaissance classics. And I hope that you'll join me.